Hello, everybody. Hope you're well. Hope you're enjoying the warm weather. If you're in the northern hemisphere like me, it's pretty toasty where I am. And I know the word hemisphere can be quite triggering for some these days, but you know what I mean. Anyway, back with you today to talk about the topic of acceptance. And I was inspired to make this video after having a little conversation through someone that watched my previous video where I was talking about natural law. And the chap who commented was talking about how quite often in the new age or spiritual arena there is quite a passive sentiment that moves through where people talk about oneness as though it's some kind of smushy kumbaya, everyone holding hands, passive sentiment where we just preach acceptance and love and that's it. So, and I think it's a good comment to make, because often those are the kind of things that people will think about when they hear some of the language that I use. And I want to start off by saying that I appreciate this guy's comment first of all, because it gives me an opportunity to come back and share and talk to some of the topics that I think might be a spin-off from some of the videos that I upload, because I'm aware that sometimes there'll be questions or challenges, but if I was to address every one of those in every video, then the videos would just go on for hours and hours. So it's good to be able to get some feedback and then come back with a relevant response on a relevant topic that I think is important to tie into all this. Because I will start off by saying that when it comes to the law of one, I don't think that is something to be taken lightly or something to be considered as a passive sentiment, because actually working with the law of one really calls a person into a lot more accountability and responsibility for their actions, for their choices, and the kind of energies that they are working with. So for me, understanding and honouring the law of one can be quite a difficult process, especially when there are things happening in the world that are unsightly, evil, heinous, dark. There's a lot of that going on the planet today, as I acknowledged last time. And so I understand it's difficult sometimes to acknowledge and be in sync with some of this stuff, because it goes against the ego's need to react and object to and justify certain actions in the, let's say, carnal world of the human life. But I do believe that at the core of every human soul is the desire to want the best for humanity, want the best for each other. And sometimes that's hard to get to because we are so reactive to what's come against us, either in a collective or individual setting. So that's where I think it's a good way to segue into acceptance, because when acceptance is something that came up in the conversation as well, and I want to explore it a little bit, because many people, when they hear the word acceptance, it's almost like a term of agreement. But when I use the term acceptance, that's not what I'm talking about. I want to move the teaching on that we often hear about presence and the power of now into the next step of that, which is acceptance. Because it's one thing to be present, it's one thing to be in the moment and experience the benefit of that. But what happens when something comes up in our experience that potentially knocks us off our perch of presence and then takes us on a spiral of judgment and hatred and anger and frustration again? That's where acceptance comes in. Because, as I say, acceptance isn't necessarily about agreeing with what happens. Sometimes it is, but it's more about understanding that what has happened couldn't be any other way by virtue of natural law. So what has happened has taken place over a collective compression of cause and effect relationships until finally something manifests in the physical. So acceptance is about understanding that the law is always in play, because the law never fails. It can't ever not be in play. So when something takes place in my personal experience or on the collective stage, then I can move into a frequency of acceptance, which again isn't about condoning. It's just about being able to take a step back, take a couple of breaths, and ask ourselves, what's the deeper current here? What's the deeper witnessing? What's the deeper law at play? Because if I just work in reaction all the time, if I'm just responding to things through my emotions all the time, then I don't necessarily resolve the issue. And I did talk a little bit in the previous video about that, about what happens when we hold resentment, judgment, hatred, and a sense of needing to get justice the way that we see it according to our beliefs, and how that can affect not just our own body, but the collective body. Because again, we come back to the law of one. We are all one. And so the truth about the law of one at its deepest level is that if evil or hatred exists in one person, then every single being on the planet has the potential to express that in some way. And that doesn't mean to say that we're all evil, but it means to say that what exists in one exists in the whole. And so knowing that and understanding the law of one brings me back again into a place of looking at how I can accept the image, accept the experience as it is, and then have space to come to a centered point of recognition of the law, and then think about what's the most harmonious, lawful choice that I can make now to make sure that I don't keep feeding that field of aggression, of hatred, of adversary, or whatever it might be. So this is about understanding that reality just is what it is. It's not about condoning people's behaviour, but it's not about turning a blind eye to it either. Because what we have done through our history is reject and push away from and block out things that we consider evil and harmful and hatred. Understandably so, because that's how the human works, that's how the ego works, in separation. So of course there's no judgment there. But what I'm trying to do with these videos is offer a framework which enables a person to start working more lawfully with creation, so that they can start seeing more balance, not just in their own life, but in everybody else around them as well. Because we've been repeating patterns for lifetimes here, and the current of the planet right now, you could say, is very similar to where we were in the late 1700s with French Revolution, American independence, things like that. And what happened in those times? The bad guys got taken out, seemingly. But the patterns that caused those bad guys to rise never really got resolved, and so inevitably they just rise up again. So looking at it through the eyes of law means that we can understand the deeper root of what's going on, so that we can make the changes necessary to ensure that those patterns don't repeat. And as I've said, I think it's important to remember that it's not about getting everyone to do it all at once. A lot of people want unconditional love, but they want everyone else to go first, for example, and so working with law means that you've got to do it yourself. You've got to stand in it yourself and understand your relationship to it, so that you can start to see those benefits. Because when you reorient yourself with the law and start walking in it, you will also start to understand the macro picture and understand how everything has started to come together and has manifested as it has now. And I've talked briefly in other videos about the collective pattern, the chronology of human history, and how on its basic level you could put it down to the fact that human beings chose to turn away from the providence and the protection of the divine and start to rely on their own nature, their own ability to grab and hold and store. But over lifetimes, how that's turned into tribalism and identity politics and all this kind of stuff, without us really understanding the root cause of where all this stuff comes from. And the word root, I think, is very important to focus on in this, because we as a humanity often have a lot of issues that stem from our roots. As children, the first 7 years of our life, it's where we're really rooting our body into the earth and coming into a harmonized relationship with the physical field. So the body is, the soul is really starting to orient itself into what physical life is. And any fracturing that takes place in those first 7 years is going to affect the roots of the being. And if those roots aren't resolved, if there is trauma, if there's abuse, if there's things going on in those early years, the child starts to build its identity around that. It starts to build belief systems around that. So a child, for example, that has an unstable root system might have beliefs of, I'm not enough, I don't belong, nobody loves me, I need to fight for survival. And so if the issue isn't dealt with at the roots, it starts to climb the tree and it becomes part of the whole system, and it starts to find its way into every branch. And what I mean by that is every choice that we make is fed by those primal fracturings that we hold. So the collective has dealt with that issue. The collective has disconnected from its root. And this is where the sentiment of the whole matrix traps comes from, because the matrix is just the mother field. But we have people out there saying that we're trapped in some matrix without recognizing the divine containment that is provided by the mother field, the matrix field, the womb of creation. So these collective traumas, which I believe that if I could say that humanity had a collective wound, it would be belonging. Where do I belong? I don't belong here. That's why many people are trying to go up and out into the stars, because they don't want to fully root into the earth, which is actually what the soul's job is. So maybe getting a bit off track there, but it's just to explain that these things come from somewhere. These things have roots in something, and when we can see the bigger picture and how the law is at play, It means that we don't just judge a person by their action. We understand that there is something deeper going on. Because if I could go up to the highest level of a person's life and look at their entire history, I would be able to see through cause and effect how it all came to be, and I'd be able to understand exactly why they did what they did. And also through humility, I would have to recognize that if I was them, I would have done the same thing, because I would have been conditioned by the same circumstances. And I'll bring Yeshua in here, as I always do, because this is really the law that he was teaching, humility. Don't judge, because if you judge, you're also by association a hypocrite. That's why he said you've got to make sure that before you're pointing out the splinter in somebody else's eye, you're removing the plank from your own. Because if we're honest with ourselves, we've all had a bit of clutter in the heart that's forced us to deal with people in an unkind or an unlawful way. And it's not about blame or judgment, because as I said, all these things come from somewhere. But when we give ourselves space to remember that, it means that we aren't so reactive. And the word reactive is important, because react means do again. So I've used this analogy before, but if you react to hate with hate, you just get more hate. And we all know that. You can't fight fire with fire. That's just law. And an interesting point that the chap I was speaking to brought up was he was giving the analogy of mould and saying, from this kind of come by our perspective, that if you just project love onto the mould, it doesn't mean that the mould is going to go away. And I completely agree with him on that. And what I came back with was to say, mould exists because we don't clean up after ourselves. And evil is the same thing. Darkness, hatred, anger, all these things that create calamity on the planet, it's the same because we don't clean up after ourselves spiritually. And what I mean by that is we don't let go. We hold on to the past. We judge people. We hold on to hatred and vengeance and envy and greed and lust in our heart. And then that makes us do things that then adds to the collective field of distortion. And then something rises in the physical to show us the reflection of that. And we judge the image without recognizing the source of that image. So that's what I think is very important to recognize when I'm talking about acceptance. It's not about condoning. It's not about agreeing. It's about understanding that everything that occurs here is a condition of law. And if I start to understand how the laws are at play, how they've brought this to be, then it means that I can start responding to creation lawfully and accordingly rather than reactively and just doing the same thing again. Because we've seen how that works. The pattern of history is repeated, and it might keep repeating. But you personally don't need to keep repeating it. You can start to walk with the law today and change your life. Because there are people on this planet, and I don't say this to create separation or division, but there are people on this planet living in paradise and absolutely loving their life with nature, with God, with all creation, living in harmony. They've already found paradise because they've learned this. They've really embodied the teachings of Jesus, And so I'm not saying that there aren't horrible things going on the planet, but we also have to be aware of how we are building algorithms and echo chambers, Skinner boxes, by how we put our attention and fix it on one thing. Because if you follow the conspiracy people, the truthers, and even the mainstream media, that will get you corralled into a particular perspective that tells you this is the way the world is. But when you're out here in the world, it's not necessarily like that. I personally don't feel like I've got any opposition out here. I'm not saying people don't experience that, but I'm talking about how I've learned to work with the law in my own way so that I'm not in friction with the field. And that's another point to come back to acceptance, is understanding energetically how it works. Because when you are in opposition to something, when you reject something and you push it away, you don't want to hear it, you don't want to know about it, it doesn't resolve. It just stays in the field, creating more friction. And then eventually that friction, that energy is going to build up to a point where something in the physical has to happen to make it resolve again. Whereas acceptance is about neutralizing the field, seeing it as God sees it, using the law of one to understand this is still part of the one, and that this person who has been horrible to me, behind their identity and their belief system and their opinions and everything they've done, there's still a pure soul there, and God knows that, and they're not irredeemable. So everybody is pure within the smallest speck of who they are in their soul. There is a purity there that God still has hold of, and they are never out of reach of God. Through the law of return, everyone will at some point return back and see God and be redeemed. And I want that for everybody. I'm not saying that we just have to let everyone run the streets doing what they want, but it's about understanding that while ever I hold on to anger, judgment, bitterness, resentment towards people and towards the world, I don't resolve it. I just reinforce that field. So that's a really important thing to be thinking about with acceptance. It's never about agreement. As I said, sometimes it might be, but it's more about understanding that there is a deeper current here, a deeper witness, a deeper expression that I might be able to understand through the lens of law, through the lens of the divine, so that I can release it, redeem it. Christ the Redeemer is the one who sees everything in its wholeness. That's why Jesus was able to do what he could do, because he saw everyone as already whole, because he could look beyond their identity, their belief systems that they've taken on through trauma, through abuse, through dogma, through extremism, through media, through truth. All these currents that basically shape who we are, they're just narratives. And when we detach from those and actually live in accordance with creation as we see it experientially, life can be completely different. So this is where acceptance, this is what I mean, and this is why I think acceptance is so important, because at the end of the day, it's about harmony. You could say we live in a big sound. A lot of people would say it's all just a big om. And from a Christian perspective, maybe the word made matter, the word made flesh. Matter is just frozen sound that eventually breaks up and starts vibrating again. But it's always moving at its macroscopic level. So it's just the vibration of sound. And what do we like about sound? We like it when it's harmonized. So the inquiry for the individual there is, how do I harmonize with this versus how do I keep opposed to it? Because opposition just creates more friction. So this isn't about opening yourself up to attack, and if someone's coming at you with a weapon, let's say, just going, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the energetic foundations, because you'll find that if you are more in harmony with life, that you're not going to have these physical challenges coming at you all the time anyway. And if you ever do, there is such a thing as sacred defense, of course. But after you've defended yourself, what are you going to do then? Are you going to keep hating, keep judging, keep resenting that person? Because if you are, your body's going to cop that as much as their body, as much as the collective body. So that's where, again, we circle back to acceptance, because there's no point holding on to judgment. There's no point holding on to hatred. Doesn't mean we don't resolve and neutralise threats and abhorrent behaviour. But how are we going to keep angry and resentful towards that? And I'm almost finished, but I'll just leave this with this example just to kind of round it off, because I have talked before about sexual energy and what happens when we don't let that flow naturally. I talked a bit about priests and how through the path they choose, a lot of them repress and shame that energy. I'll also bring in the spiritual world, because a lot of gurus and spiritual teachers as well are doing that, either for things like semen retention or shaming release through tantra and things like this. But we also are hearing so many accounts at the moment of spiritual teachers sexually harming others. Why? Because they shame that energy that needs to be moving, that needs to be in motion through the law of motion, through the law of release, and they keep it stagnant. When something is stagnant, it'll eventually find its way out, and it'll come out in a distorted way. Because if you're projecting shame onto that part of your body, you're building shame, and eventually that shame is going to release itself, and it might come out in some kind of act against another, or something deviant or disgusting that you do, but it's still a condition of law. So what's the deeper law? I wasn't in rhythm with the law of motion, the law of release, and then something distorted comes of that. So just like with the mold, if we just turn away from it and don't acknowledge it, it'll just keep growing. And the same with evil. If we just want to shut it out and chop all the heads off, it never resolves anything. We've tried that. We've tried chopping the heads off, but just like weeds, it keeps coming back. So do we want to just take the top block off the pyramid, or do we want to understand what the root of the pyramid is and how we all collectively play a part in that? So I hope I've been clear with the video. I always want to make sure that you understand I'm not condoning any bad behaviour. I'm just looking at it through the lens of law, because then we can see the path forward with clarity and truth over emotionalism and reaction, because that's where we've been. And I'll just finish with Yeshua and remind that, he was named a high priest of the Melchizedek order. Melchizedek simply means righteous king, king of righteousness, and their pattern is about law. But if you were to listen to someone like Paul Selig, for example, I don't normally recommend channelers, but Paul Selig, I believe, is one who is quite pure, and he's channeling what he calls the Melchizedek current. And if you listen to his words, they're just pure law. There's no emotion to them. It's just like listening to an AI, really. And that's okay if you don't mind that kind of thing. But you can imagine in Jesus' time, he was embodying that. He was embodying the sword of Melchizedek, which is cutting through the nonsense through with law and truth. But if he just came and spoke in some monotone way, it wouldn't land in the human spirit. So he came with heart, he came with warmth, he came with emotion, he came with relation, so that he could speak to people in a way that their soul would hear the information, embody that information, and truly feel it, so that they could actually walk with it. Again, he came to be a living embodiment, a fulfillment of the law, so that we might learn how to do that in our own way. Still be compassionate and still be kind, but also understand that there is an impersonal, lawful current behind everything that takes place. And when we know that, we can walk with more acceptance in our lives. We can walk with more not neutrality in the way that we don't choose an opinion, but neutrality in the way that we feel more balanced. We feel more in coherence with our field, rather than always putting up a wall against something. Because as I've said, energetically over time, that's just going to break itself down anyway. Whatever you try and separate yourself from, that wall will eventually get pulled down, because separation is the ultimate illusion. And that's what the law of one reminds us in the end, is that there's only one of us here. So who can be against you at the end of the day? Maybe these oppressors, maybe these opponents are just there as an effect of a cause that I've not fully understood. So what's the cause of this, and how can I play my part in making sure that we don't do it again? I'll leave it there. All right, I'll speak to you next time. Bye.